Sometimes I catch glimpses of that girl I used to be, when my kids catch me dancing barefoot in the kitchen. Moments when I feel light and at ease, where I'm not worrying about whose eyes are on me. They are sacred, yet fleeting reminders that there is more to me that bubbles at the surface every now and then, and I'm over reining it in. I want a life that's brimming with unfettered delight. I want days unfurling with joy, with glee. I want more of whatever used to make my soul sing so easily. I'm relearning what it means to nurture those precious parts of me. Some days it feels like a fight, fighting for the willpower not to care who is watching, not giving fear the real estate it's had all these years, not letting people's words or ill intentions be a reason to hold my arms close again. But I'll do it. I'll fight to be a woman with a little girl's heart. Hi, I am Dr. Kim Sage, and I wanted to share that quote I read. I was just online, just kind of, poking around, looking at news, and I came across this quote from, I guess it's a new memoir by Joanna Gaines. And this isn't about her or the book or anything like that. But when I read that last line, I thought to myself, well, I don't really remember ever feeling like a little girl. I feel like I came out of the womb in this really heightened state of awareness, extremely sensitive, always scanning for threat, and also needing to rotate around a parent in ways to keep myself safe. And so the idea of trying to get back to the carefreeness, I mean, of course there are moments in time I can sort of think about, but I don't really have this like, oh, I was that carefree young girl and now I'm this sort of more in control or rigid adult, kind of what I think she's referring to. And I thought, I wonder how many of us feel that way. And so, it's like great for you, Joanna, but I can't really go back to being a bubbling little girl, a light and bubbling little girl. And I think for many of us, that's true. We really lost our childhoods. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can really lose that, and a couple things we can do to begin to start working on healing that. This sort of intersection between hypervigilance and parentification, and a lot of that is, really what I talk about so much here, which is what happens to us when we're not allowed to have the free-flowing development of a child. No child has a perfect childhood, but whether it's medical trauma, divorce, parents who are enmeshed or have their own mental health issues, all of those things can significantly shape and impact who we become alongside our genetics. And so I think that's why sometimes it's hard to connect to this idea of inner child work. It made me think about, even in my course on the inner child, I think the reason why I also believe there's an inner parent is because for me, it doesn't feel possible to only tap into that. To me, there are these two forces we're holding inside. And so for many of us, we kind of like came out of the womb, like 30-year-old divorced people. We'd already been down that road and, gone to rehab, sort of, I'm joking, but it's like we just didn't really have the luxury of being safe in our bodies because of our need for hypervigilance, which is often because of parents who were sort of like this. They yelled and screamed a lot, or they were happy, they were angry, or they were always upset. Whatever it wasn't safe to relax in our bodies. And so we often end up being, perfectionists and super serious, and we can have a hard time tapping into the joy in ourselves. And I want to just briefly pause and kind of direct this sort of towards attachment, which is that I think for so many of us who have these childhoods, whatever the label is, it really is a mix of avoidant, sorry, I just joked, avoidant and anxious attachment, which, really is kind of how disorganized can play out. But all of us, I think, have these general styles. We can lean into other styles, of course, based on the people we're with. But if you think about what happens, let's say in this kind of childhood where you have hypervigilance and parentification, let's say in one of the homes, you have to basically really be hypervigilant and rotate around the parent's mood. And so you're scanning for that dynamic to change. And so you have to really first, your orientation is to be about the other person first. It's an outside in, like I talk about from Dan Brown's work in the anxious attachment style. And so I can only be good when you're good. But the parentified part can also come in, especially I would say for Gen X, but really this is could be in any childhood, where at the end of the day though, your job was to take care of that parent emotionally, but also they didn't really take care of a lot of your needs. It could be emotional neglect, could be physical neglect, it could just be kind of a generation of parents that were like, you guys are on your own from, sunset to sundown. And so you have to also fully and auto-regulate yourself. And so we can have these extremes of being very anxious in relationships, as I've talked about, like, once we're in it, we're like, oh my God, you're going to leave me, don't leave me. But also feel this fear of being completely engulfed. Coco, come here, Coco. Coco's in my Amazon packaging this morning. Come here. So the problem is that can play out, right? And then for other people who kind of lean into that hypervigilance for other reasons, for maybe it was a grandparent or something else happened or a medical issue in a parent they had to be aware of, the parent maybe could, be at risk or something, but also care for themselves. They can have these really variations of avoidant and anxious qualities that can also really be manifested in significant ways depending upon who they're in relationship with. So some of the signs, for example, and kind of how this plays out when you are really rotating around a parent to please them, but also living in that place where you don't get to be seen as a child. We often have a hard time with play and just like letting go of control. We can be very controlling, and that's actually more common even in the children of borderline mothers. That some of the research showed in the clinical population that the kids were more controlling, more bossy, which makes a lot of sense. When there's chaos at home, you're trying to find ways to contain and manage that inside. And don't forget, all of this attachment stuff goes back to the connection with how you make internal self-regulatory and tolerating different emotions in yourself based on the attachment patterns. So we're learning not just like is this a safe attachment source, but we're using their caregiving to internalize our own safety with emotions and tolerating unhappy emotions or unsafe emotions, and how to also regulate ourselves, right? We don't learn to regulate as well and tolerate different range of emotions. We have this chaotic attachment pattern. And that also affects, of course, our exploratory behavior, right? So all of these things can play out in, like I'm saying, feeling like you were the good one, the responsible one, as I've often said, an old soul in other videos, which is a common thing that kids hear. Becoming a caregiver for others and having to be the peacemaker, and yet feeling like you don't really exist as a child. It's just like you have all these roles and it's about making sure the parent's okay. And then when you add that to the hypervigilance part, which is connected, it's like this is an elevated state of detecting threat at all times. And so when we think about that, we're thinking about kind of two kinds of threat. One is like a looming anxiety, like something is going to happen tomorrow, today, next week, or soon. It's a relevant sort of like it's coming anxiety. And then we have the other level of really chronic hypervigilance that also goes with this, that's more grounded in our childhood trauma, where we learned in our body that we can't trust this parent or this experience, right? And so all of that manifests in a lot of symptoms of living in really chronic hypervigilant states. Especially, we have, of course, behavioral symptoms like, heart racing and things like that, panic symptoms, difficulty sleeping. And we have it in our behaviors, how we can show up by, having a really strong startle response and not being able to focus on things. But the way this often plays out is in terms of attachment is in our interpersonal and our emotional relationships in our lives. And so we often, live in worry. We're worriers. We panic. We fear the worst. We take everything personally. We're constantly playing out scenarios and mapping out in our head the 5,000 different ways everything can go wrong. We overreact. We can often struggle with social situations because our bodies are in that heightened state of threat, and they've learned to rotate around and be compulsive caretakers, or that having that outside in orientation. And so think about that. If your nervous system is like, scanning for threat, meaning threat, a parent's going to yell or roll their eyes, and that's going to cause the other parent to start a fight, or you're going to get in trouble. And you add that you've learned to hyper-focus combined, right? All of this stuff makes it really hard to feel like you're in your childhood when you're actually in it. And that is why reading a quote today about, I would like to go back to being a carefree child, my very first gut reaction was like, what the is that? Like, I don't really want to go back to that either. But I do want to tap into the purity and the innocence of that and the carefreeness of that, because my fears, my chronic anxiety of bad things happening to me, to my kids, to the world, especially right now, it makes us so negatively wired, but also so stressed. And so things like, which could be good for us, social connection, for many of us, we have those, but they're also very stressful, from large social events to even small ones, especially if things stay surfacey and there's no real connection over time. I have a very bad, response to that, which is like, I don't want to BS with people, and I have to. I think I said this in other videos, like I would, in the early part of my trying to get back in this field after getting a master's in the 90s and then going back for a doctorate, like, 10 years ago, whatever it was, I would go to social events, like networking events, and I would panic and I would leave, because I hate small talk. I'm so bad at it. Though I can fake being, extroverted, I'm extremely introverted and was a very shy child. And my mom was so extroverted, and so was my dad. It was just like, oh my God, you're so embarrassing. But it makes me in my body so uncomfortable. And so when you add that into my overreading everybody, and what did that mean? They shook my hand and, what are you doing now? And when did you get your degree? Or, you have 4 kids, like that's a lot by yourself. All these stupid things. I had to find other ways. And frankly, in some ways, making content was a way for me to grow my practice and meet people, because I is safe with the camera, right? It's so much safer. And so it's just one of those things where you might notice that you can go to social events, but you might dread them right before you go, and you get there and then you're like, that wasn't that bad. But then afterwards you're replaying everything you said and did and how your body was weird. So all of that kind of like over-focusing literally in that hypervigilant state, combined with the need to like compulsively check everyone else first, it's really exhausting. Right? It's so depleting, and I think it's a huge reason why obviously our bodies wear down because of the constant flood of cortisol and neurochemicals associated with living in fight or flight. And then relationally, that's combined with this like expectation that there's no space for us, and that we have to always be on guard, which is like serious and not so fun. And unless, of course, we're using substances, for many of us, that is the only time we can let our bodies relax, or we're in an addiction like shopping or gambling or whatever. We have to get out of our bodies. And that's why we all talk so much about this is in your body, and you have to do that work. So there's a lot of things, of course, you can do to work on this, from therapy to medications, if that's something you want to focus on, to mindfulness and yoga and all the polyvagal theory work. But I wanted to just give you 2 things to focus on today as you're thinking about this. If you feel like, I don't know what it really feels like to be a child, but I love the idea of connecting back to not living in this state and to finding the things that brought me joy, and or the things I did. It's like, what did you play with when you were a kid? Just because it was fun to play with, not because it was socially acceptable or it looked good on a screen, right? It's like, who were you and who are you now, and how can you tap into the idea of the child as something that isn't living in this very sculpted and shaped trauma response afterwards. Of course, you're never going to be able to completely erase that. I think it's a setup to think that you can, but I think you can find ways to, as I always say, to not live in it. So just 2 things. Number 1, I would say, honestly, if all you did was start to notice when you felt that rise in your chest, that squeezing feeling, the neck tightening, whatever it is, maybe you come in the door and you notice that your kids are, giving you a weird look, and your first reaction is, what did I do now? What are you mad about now, right? Is to pause that and to just do some breathing. And I think that the breathing technique, it's as simple as this. Whatever number you choose, to breathe in and to exhale longer with a pause in the middle. So something like breathing in for a count of 4, pausing for a count of 4, can't do this one, and then exhaling for like a count of 6. So it looks like this. I like to really sigh, and it feels embarrassing to do it in front of someone else, but if you sigh at the end, you will really feel that in your body. So doing that a handful of times. So just focus on that. And the second thing, to tap into this idea of play in the child, is to think about what brings you joy. I don't care if it's walking your dog, making a cake, knitting, a sports thing, whatever it is. I want you to pick one thing that you do. For me, it has always been, and it's a double-edged sword. I'm not supposed to have a lot of sugar, but I love to bake and I love to cook. And it's something I really have wanted to incorporate even into this work in some ways. And I'm still trying to figure out how to do that. But it brings me so much joy. And so to just do one thing this week, just one thing, and try when you're doing it to be in it and to think about, what would my child self feel like right now to be doing this, right? How great would it feel to be doing this? Whether it's building Legos, like it doesn't even matter. It could be coloring. It could be anything related to actual child activities or adult activities. But to try to just combine the breathing with the mindfulness of choosing something that is related to a bubbling, carefree spirit, a joy, something that you did because there was no payoff and reward. It's just something that brings you joy. I think this is an important place to start. And if you don't live with this intentionally in your mind, especially if you had a childhood where you were in a state of parentification and hypervigilance, and you don't even know, like I sat there and I was like, well, that sounds great, but what is that? So if that's you, I hope you might think about or just consider something like this, and feel free to share more ideas down below. So thank you so much for being here. Please consider subscribing if you like this video and want more like it. There are a whole bunch more videos I've made about these kind of topics. And also there's some links for the courses I've created down below. Please feel free to check those out on reparenting, on having a toxic childhood, and also a free course on understanding if you really experienced wounding in your childhood that maybe you didn't even know was valid and that wasn't okay. So thank you for being here. Have a beautiful weekend, and I will see you next Saturday. Take care. Bye-bye.